Have you ever worked with a BCBA or acted as a consultant yourself for a public school? I'm sure the answer is probably yes. Everyone's nodding their head. The new thing, what it seems is happening, is that school districts are hiring BCBAs as public school employees, which is wonderful, which is amazing, which is something that is changing in the field. We used to have more of a consultant model where maybe the BCBA works for a clinic and comes into the public school and acts in that consultant role. A BCBA coming in and acting as a public school employee, just there's a lot of different things that you may not know about being an outsider to public education. There are a lot of systems in place. There are a lot of people. There are a lot of connections you need to make. So today, my guest, Melissa Connor-Santos, we get into all of that. She's passionate advocate for improving behavior analytics services to children in public schools. She is a wealth of information. She's an adjunct faculty member at Endicott College, where she's also finishing her doctoral degree. And she also served on the New Jersey Department of Education BCBA advisory panel, where she contributed to the creation of practice guidelines for school-based BCBAs in the state. I think this is something that's happening more and more in the field, which I think is wonderful for a BCBA to be a public school employee for just a whole host of reasons. I have been a public school speech therapist in some capacity for over 20 years. So obviously, I believe in public education. I love that that's a least restrictive environment for students, that they can be in touch with their community. So today we are talking all about what happens when a BCBA is working in a public school as an employee. Stay tuned for this conversation.
You're listening to Autism Outreach Podcast, a podcast full of ready-to-use strategies to help those with autism strengthen their communication skills. Here's your host, Rose Griffin of ABA Speech, a speech therapist and board-certified behavior analyst who shares tips you can use in your next therapy session.
Welcome to the Autism Outreach Podcast. We have a great guest for you today. We have with us Melissa Connor-Santos. Thank you so much, Melissa, for coming on to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I was just telling Melissa before I pressed record that I think I came across her information or maybe a training that she did about what we're going to kind of discuss today on LinkedIn. I talk about social media a lot here, Melissa, because I've grown my entire business, ABA Speech, from 0 to 40,000 email subscribers on social media. And LinkedIn, I feel like if you're not on LinkedIn, you think maybe like it's stuffy and it's like not really social media, but it's social media. And there's actually a lot of really amazing BCBAs there. Like I think I connected with Dr. Sarah Frampton over there, Dr. Cody Morris, Bruce Tinner, like all these amazing people who are doing such great work in the field. And the information that you shared about ABA in the public schools came across my feed. And I was like, ooh, I need to talk to this person because I feel like this is such a cool conversation and something that is new, is really kind of changing in the field. So, I've been dually certified. So I'm a speech therapist in BCBA. I've been a BCBA for about 12 years now. And just seeing the growth of ABA and people who are certified over that amount of time has absolutely been staggering. Like I'm here in Ohio.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing? And they showed charts before, like where it was just like a line. It was like this. It was like, this is how many BCBAs there used to be. And now there's a bunch. And conferences going from like one single track of like less than 100 people to now getting top keynote speakers and, just so many different breakout sessions. So it's really, really been cool. I know that you've been in the field for many years. How have you seen ABA and kind of this idea of BCBAs in the schools change over that time? Let me know how long have you been certified as a BCBA as well?
I've been in the field of ABA for 15 years.
Okay.
I've been certified for 10 years.
Okay.
And then I actually came to ABA by way of education. So I'm a certified teacher in special education and general education, and I was working in the field of education for about 5 years before I stumbled upon ABA, and that became my life and took over my life.
Yes. Wonderful. I love that. Have you seen now? So I work 2 days a week as a public school speech therapist right now. I have 3 kids of my own. And so it's kind of nice for me to run this small business and work in their actual school. It's been fun. And I always say the town I live in I always call it Mayberry, which is like a very old reference, but it's just like a very
I
small
know it. I
little,
know the reference.
okay, whoo. Okay, I'm very old here, but it's a very small, like little town. Like it's just very teeny. And we have in our district, which I think is very progressive, and we have a great sped director. We have a BCBA who is employed by the district and is just one BCBA for the district. But I do think that it's really great to have that support in the district and to just work in a district that's really progressive in the fact that there's a lot of things that come up where, when the BCBA is coming in as an outside consultant versus when the BCBA is somebody that is working in the district. And so I think have you seen that change over your 10 years in the field?
Yeah,
Like that, it used to be the
absolutely.
consultant model, right?
Yeah, much more consultant if they had a consultant at all, right?
Right,
So,
right. Bingo.
I would say, I live here in New Jersey. So one of the biggest things I've seen change is, and I think one of the reasons we've seen so much growth in BCBAs in public schools is sort of this change of, if you were a student with more significant challenges, whether those be behavioral, cognitive, physical, those kids always went out of district. They never were in their home schools. And so they went to specialized schools where there might be BCBAs or speech therapists or those other people, but you didn't see them as much in the public school because it was just automatically there was this perception of, oh, we can't help you here. You got to go somewhere, much more specialized than we can handle. And that has changed so dramatically in the time that I've been in the field. Now it's really the opposite. Now we are absolutely going to serve you here in the public school. And there are very few instances where we're going to have somebody go to a more specialized placement. And we're going to really exhaust this public school placement and what we can do here before we go, hey, we need more specialized treatment. That is really what has happened a lot here in New Jersey, for sure. And so I think that what I've seen happen, and I have colleagues across the country that work in public schools that I, confer with and that I do research with, that have said they've seen sort of similar things, right? Where these were, some of the children we serve were kids that were just not, the public school just didn't know how to help them. They didn't have the skill set, so they'd send them out. And then, the consultation model for sure was really heavy. I have worked as a consultant and I still do from time to time, but many more schools are bringing in their own BCBAs as faculty, sometimes with multiple BCBAs on staff.
Yeah.
I just recently transitioned out of a district to pursue some other things, but there were 5 of us on staff, which is a huge number of BCBAs to be in a public school.
Yeah. Yeah. I had talked to, his name is Seth, and we had met at a conference, this really cool conference I keynoted at earlier this year in Greenville, but we were talking, I think I had connected with him on LinkedIn a really long time ago. And we were like, he was maybe going to do a talk for us. It didn't work out. But he had worked in Boston. And I remember him saying that he helped, which is like such a dense area of ABA, I feel like, but he had helped get a public school like group. And I think maybe when they left, I don't know if it was like 17 BCBAs. It was like some very large number where you're like, wow, to like, number one, have a BCBA that's employed as a public school employee is kind of a neat option for people that want to, because there's like, depending on how you cut it, there's perks to that. But to actually not be the solo one there, to actually have other people to collaborate with is really nice, because I can imagine one BCBA, like I'm on that Facebook group that's for BCBAs that are in public schools. I don't know if you're on that. It's a good one. And it's like, I know some people will be like, I'm a BCBA and now I'm going to like start this department, or I'm like the only BCBA. And here they are tasked with this like actually huge undertaking of what does ABA look like when you're an employee of a public school district. I think there's just like a lot of ethical things that go into that. Knowing, I teach the ethics class here at Kent State every fall. There's just a lot of ethical considerations, right, that are so different. Yeah. Like I always kind of, I make a lot of like reels and short form video on Instagram. And, sometimes I'll make one about working with an outside consultant, because even though I'm a speech therapist and a BCBA, I would have parents in districts I've worked in the past that are really affluent, want to have advocates come in and lawyers and try to angle your consultant to make the public school staff feel less than and that like they're not doing their best. And it's just it's a weird mix. Although it never made me feel bad, because I remember one time Dr. Mark Sundberg was talking about how he was in a meeting, or really some kind of contentious case, and they were like, well, he was the evaluator. He did like the BCBA or something. And then the parents were like, well, we want somebody to give the BCBA. And it was like, this is the person who created the whole instrument. I'm like, if somebody's going to say that, you know what I mean? Like, it's okay. That consultant model makes sense sometimes. It's just to make everybody happy and make sure they're feeling heard. But so with all that being said, why is it important? There's this idea, I think something maybe you're working on at Endicott. Why is it important for BCBAs who are working in the schools to have specific training about that setting? Why do you find that to be so important?
I really think, first and foremost, it really goes back to our ethical code, right? We have this ethical obligation to have a scope of competence in the areas that we're working as BCBAs. And it's not just a little individual guideline. It's in those overarching, parts of the code that thread throughout, right? So I think first and foremost, it's unethical to be working in a school or in any setting really with populations that you don't have some scope of competence. Now, when I say that, I realize that there are times when that's easier said than done, right? If you work in a really small town where there's no other BCBAs available, and you're the only person available to be in this school, and you've never worked in a school before, does that mean you shouldn't take the job? Our ethical code says there's, decision-making models that we have to use to kind of figure out what we need to do in order to do our best work in that setting. So it's not an automatic no, but, I think that one of the biggest challenges of working in public schools as compared to working maybe like in a clinic or home setting is that you have these really large systems that you are working within that you as a BCBA have absolutely no control over. And a lot of those systems have been in place for a really long time, right? On the federal level, on the state level, on the local district level, right? And so there's layers too, right? So I think it's really hard. And I know I talk to many BCBAs that are looking to go into public school work or have recently made the change into public school work. And overwhelmingly, these people reach out to me and say, oh my gosh, like, this is crazy. Like, I don't know what to do here. And I think what happens is, and I can attest to this because I think I was very guilty of this. I went from a really rigid, really high quality clinical setting. I was working with Dr. Bridget Taylor in one of the best
she's been on the show.
Programs in the country, right? Yes. That had all these, and all these big names would come in to talk to us, like Dr. Peter Gerhardt and Dr. Heward, and like all of these, that was the environment I came out of. And then I got plopped into a public school, and I really thought ABA was supposed to look like that. And it took me about a year to figure out that that's never going to happen, right?
Were you doing a 30-second DRO? Were you doing a 30-second DRO?
I wasn't, thankfully. I actually, my first job in the public schools was as a teacher. So I was the self-contained autism teacher. I was in the middle of, I was finishing up I was about to sit for the exam. So it was sort of like my bridge job before I passed the boards. And I knew I wanted to work in public schools. So I actually made that decision to take that job because I was like, I need to know how to do this. I can't just have this super clinical experience, right? And boy, did I struggle. Oh my gosh, because I really thought it should look like that. And
Yeah.
I've realized that not only is it almost impossible to make it look like that, but I'm not sure that it should or it has to,
Yeah.
right? I think you can
Mhm.
get really nice progress from kids having, being in school, having access to their community. Maybe it's not 40 hours of ABA all the time, right?
Mhm.
Not every kid needs that,
Right.
Um, but having access to peer models, like things like that, you don't necessarily always get in those other settings.
Mhm.
But I think when you don't have the scope of competence and you come in, someone like me, right, who is in a very clinical environment and going into a school, you have a really hard time wrapping your head around how you're going to get all of this stuff done. Now, and two, you're also working with non-behavior analytic staff.
Yeah.
So you're asking people to do things that they've never been trained to do. Maybe, quite frankly, they don't want to do,
Mhm.
right? So
Mhm.
you have all of these obstacles. So I think it's really important if you're not going to burn out, right, and leave
Mhm.
public schools and be like, I will never do this again. And I certainly have colleagues that say that to me. They're like,
Yeah.
Melissa, there's no way I would ever work in a public school. It's too bananas. I can't do it. You're putting out fires all the time.
Yeah.
I'd rather do this clinical. I'd rather, work in a clinic or work in homes or whatever it is. And I totally get that. But I feel that it's really important that even apart from our ethical obligation, we have BCBAs that are willing and able to work in public schools effectively, because the bottom line is that's where the majority of kids go, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
Almost every kid goes to public school,
Yeah.
right? And if we're going to be able to keep kids in their home communities and we're
Mhm.
going to be able to get really good outcomes, right? Where kids aren't maybe just skating along
Mhm.
or, or getting swept under the rug, or like that kid that's in the principal's office every day because they have all these behavioral issues, right? We need BCBAs to be really good at working in those environments so that we can have this more robust impact.
I love that. Yes, more robust impact. I too have worked in non-public programs, Cleveland Clinic, Learner School. I'm laughing because Peter Gearhart, our boss at the time was friends with him, and he came to our clinic, and he did before he was like keynoting and doing all the amazing things he does now. It was like 20 of us, and we were hearing him talk. It was just like it was a moment. But yeah, it is so very different to work in those two different settings. Like I think what I always struggled with as a public professional is when you get into these tricky situations. Like as a speech language pathologist, I would get into these situations where people I worked in very affluent districts, would come in with lawyers, advocates, and they would say things like, we want our child to engage in a 8-step conversation about a non-preferred topic within a group setting. And I didn't think that was the best goal to work on, right? So I always say I started my entire business because I had so much to say about autism. But in a public school, I couldn't really advocate for what I like deep down. And I'm not getting woo woo, but deep down, I really knew what was best for this student. Like, I don't think that's a functional goal. I don't think that's neurodiversity affirming. I don't think it's going to generalize. It doesn't make sense. But you get into these situations in public schools where you have a lot that you want to share and you have a lot in your mind, because people that are in ABA feel really passionate about how transformative it can
Absolutely.
be. And then you have to sit there and you can tell people things, but ultimately it's not up to you. It's not up to you because it's a team decision. And so then that gets really
Yeah.
hard because you may be trying to ethically work together, or potentially, let's say you're a BCBA and you're working in a district and the speech therapist is anti-ABA and she doesn't like BCBAs at all. And she's not going to do any of the stuff that you say, even though she's using a lot of shaping, modeling, prompting, things like that. So
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
gets into these hard situations where it isn't black and white. It's not like a clinic. We can't contrive the environment to make it like sterile and ready for learning. It's like, but what I will say is, like, when I worked in a non-public program with kids who had extreme behavior, problems and regulating their behavior, what we were always trying to do is to replicate a public school. We were trying to offer a
Yeah.
music class. We were trying to have adapted PE. We were trying to have the kids eat at a lunch table. Like, and when you work in a non-public program, you know what I'm talking about. Like, you don't just miraculously have a gym teacher and a lunchroom and a place to go outside and play. And that's why I love public education. I mean, I think working in non-public programs is amazing. And I have a lot of friends who own clinics, but there is something really special about a public school because, like you said, it's for a lot of kids, their least restrictive environment. And it generalizes to like what you said, like the community, right? Like your kids have access to their community. So you seem passionate about that too, but it's not going to be as regimented as perfect. I can imagine your first year as a teacher, you really were like, that was probably really hard for you.
Oh my gosh, it was so hard. It was so hard.
Yes.
And that particular, I remember the kids in that class so vividly because some of them were extremely they had some pretty significant challenges, not
Yeah.
just behaviorally, but I also worked with some children in that classroom that had pretty significant physical disabilities. So I
Wow.
had this like super wide range
Hmm.
of students, and I knew what they all needed. And then I just remember we had like no curriculum, or like they gave me this
Right.
curriculum.
Right.
I just remember they gave me this curriculum and they were like, oh, one of the teachers wrote this curriculum. She worked in a specialized school. And I was like, okay, great. And they were like, this is what you have to use. And I was like, okay, fine. And I remember like looking at it, and it wasn't horrible, but there were so many gaps in it.
Yeah.
Like really large learning gaps in it. And I was like, listen, I can't just do this
Right.
because there's a lot of things that this kid needs to know how to do that is not in here,
Right.
that's not in this sort of curriculum, that they had, so yeah, it was a really challenging year. Yeah, but I learned a lot from that experience.
Yeah.
And I will say that I feel like those experiences really help you become a compassionate professional, because when you go in and you're working with that teacher that got dropped into, let's say, a multiple disabilities classroom,
Hmm.
and the only reason that person is in there is because they had a special ed license, and the district went,
Hmm.
well, we need a body, so we're going to put them in there, right?
Uh-huh.
Like what
Yeah.
that feels like, right?
Right.
I always say that in schools, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to move the needle, right? So I'm not going to walk in there as a BCBA, even if I've been there a long time and I have relationships. I'm not going to probably be able to make these really sweeping changes, right?
Hmm.
There are just too many barriers, right? That have nothing to do with me, that have to do with budgets and, who the principal is and who the superintendent is and,
Yes.
what the community wants, right? But I can move the needle,
Hmm.
so I really think that that's a really important thing when you're working in public schools, is to think about, okay, I can see right off the bat that these 20 things need to be totally changed and
Hmm.
overhauled. And, I think if we were going to have really good outcomes, these are some systematic changes we need to make. But what are like the two things I can do right
Hmm.
now that's
Right.
going to make this kid happier, right?
Right.
Make these parents feel like we're doing something worthwhile,
Hmm.
make this teacher's life a little bit easier.
Hmm.
Right. And I think a lot of that too comes from really strong collaboration skills. So, talking about scope of competence, again, kind of like backtracking to that, there's all these areas that I think to be a really good BCBA in general, but to be a public school BCBA, you really have to be good at. Again, collaboration is in our ethics code,
Hmm.
right? It's something that's baked in there. I don't think we do a very good job of preparing BCBAs to be
Hmm.
good collaborators from the get-go, but there is no place that you need to be more collaborative than a public school, because you are one member of a team. You are not in a clinic where like maybe there's a speech therapist at the clinic you're working in, right? Or maybe you have a phone call, with
Right.
the other service providers, and you're saying, okay, that's how we're collaborating, right? But in a public school, you are like in each other's faces all day. You are
Yes.
all working off the same IEP document.
Mhm.
Nowhere do you have to play more appropriately in the sandbox and in a public school, right? So to figure out how to do that effectively and respectably and compassionately, man, that's hard. That is hard. And I would say I got really good at it because I didn't have a choice. I think the environment shaped my behavior,
Yeah.
right? But I'm really passionate about helping BCBAs go into those settings and not have to do what I did, right? Which is not let the system sort of maybe punish me, and punish some of my behavior and then realize that I have to change, right? That's kind of the slow rollout, right? I'd much rather try to give BCBAs, whether they be, newcomers to the field or people that are kind of doing a career change and looking to move into a school. I'd love to, help them have a skill set that they can use from day one rather than having to learn as they go, or, like I said, just sort of get, their behavior punished and have to figure it out,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. And I used to always say, like, as a public school speech therapist, in any setting, my most important job is actually not the therapy. That is not the most important job. The most important job is for me to know every member of the team and for me to really educate, encourage others about what the communication goals are. That's really what's most important. I think, yeah, I did a whole series this past summer about my first year as a speech therapist. And I talked a lot about the school, but I talked a lot about knowing everybody in the building. Like like I was working in a high school once and the principal, I was friendly with him because I had worked with him for a long time. And I utilized that friendship to set up vocational opportunities for all my students. If I wouldn't have had that relationship, and I'm an extrovert at work, so I like people. I like small talk and will talk to people. But if I wouldn't have had that relationship, I wouldn't have had all those opportunities. Like for my students, they wouldn't have gotten to do all the neat things that they did. So I think it's like really heavy on relationship building. And just like we build that connection with our clients, when you first get into a school, you really need to build a connection with the administrative assistant, the front office staff,
Oh
the
my gosh, yes.
principal, the
They're your best
teacher.
friends.
They are
They're
the
the first people
janitor.
you make friends
Yes,
with.
yes. They are the most important people in the building.
Absolutely.
I always say that.
Absolutely. That and the maintenance staff,
Yes.
100%. They are your best friends.
Yes, they are. And those are those kind of like nuanced things. So this is not the question that I was going to ask you. I hope it's okay to ask, but what do you think so if a person, let's say that somebody is leaving that clinical setting as a BCBA and they're like, you know what, for my family schedule, for like maybe my retirement, I want to get into state teachers retirement. I really think the schools are where it's at. Like I want to work 187 days. I want to be off when my kids are, and they transition into a school setting. I guess are there ACE courses out there that are good to take, and or what could people do that are transitioning into a public school as a BCBA so that they feel kind of like as ready as you can be before, being in there?
Sure. I think one of, definitely connecting with other people that are working in public schools. If you work in a state that has an ABA chapter, here in New Jersey, we have NJABA, and there's actually work groups, and one of them is a public schools work group. So you can just
Cool.
go and attend those meetings and connect with other BCBAs that are working in public schools in a more like grassroots way, so that way build those connections, talk to people at conferences. LinkedIn, right, is a great place to be there, like to make like actual connections. I don't love Facebook groups. And the reason I don't love Facebook groups is that I feel like sometimes like, I don't know, I just feel like sometimes people just go to complain or people like engage in unethical behavior. So I don't like love them, right? But I do understand why people use them, right? Because they're looking for resources and they're looking to make connections and they're really desperate to make connections, right? So I'm not gonna, I would never tell anybody not to utilize those groups. I would just say sort of like utilize those groups sort of warily, right? Because not everybody in that group is an expert, and everybody behind the computer screen and their keyboard is an expert, right? And then of course, just make sure that you're following the ethical guidelines. Like you shouldn't be asking questions about like specific clients. And I really think one of the best things you can do is, if you can, find a mentor. And I think mentors have two different flavors, right? There's your BCBA mentor, right? So connected with somebody who works in a public school, has been public school BCBA. They are willing to, problem solve with me. I have some relationships with like that, mostly people that have approached me after conferences and
Right.
have said, hey, would you be okay if I emailed you? Or would you be okay? Like, would you ever be willing to do like a Zoom with me? And
Yeah.
and most of the time, just so long as I can fit into my schedule, my answer is yes. And so I sort of have these like informal relationships with these people where
Yeah.
like every once in a while they like shoot me something and they're like, hey, I was in this like really banana situation. Like, what
Right.
do you think about all this? And like, I
Yeah.
kind of help them like think about the different angles, right? I also think mentors, when you're working in a public school, don't have to be BCBAs. And I
Yeah.
say that because there are a lot of people in those environments that understand how those environments work that
Yeah.
you might not understand,
Right.
right? Even though they have different letters to you. So I remember here in the state of New Jersey, we have this position that I think is like very unique to New Jersey, actually, called a learning disabilities teacher consultant.
Oh,
And
yeah.
basically, what their job is to do educational testing. Right, all they do
Oh,
is
right.
education testing.
Okay.
They're a member of the IEP team here. LDTCs is what we call them. So I remember when I had started at a district, I was the only BCBA on staff. It was a fairly small district, and she was my mentor, and no, I was not approaching her about, hey, I have a student in the behavioral disorders class and I'm not sure what to do. Like, that's not what
Yeah.
was happening.
Right.
I would go to her a lot and be like, hey, what's the policy on this? Or if I wanted to get this done, how do I get it done? Or if I felt like, it was really important for us to have a team meeting with the teacher, how would I go about facilitating that? Right.
Right.
And so she was really amazing and really useful. And our offices were right next to each other.
Yes.
So that was super convenient. Um, and I went to her a lot with those things,
Yeah.
there it was a kind of like we called it the sorority house because we had it was like we had this like office, and then we had this office that had like this main area and then all these like individual
Oh, that's
offices, almost
cute. Yeah.
like a
That's
dorm, right?
cute.
And the other two people that were in that office were a social worker and a school psychologist.
Oh, yeah.
And so I would just like go into the middle of the office and be like,
Right.
okay, guys, like here's my stitch, right?
Right. That's nice.
And like everybody would sort of give me their take from their perspective fields, or, I might go to one of them and say, hey, the student's having, really significant behavior issues, but I also know that child protective services involved. So I think that
Right.
that's a lot going on here. So like these people mentored me in how
Yeah.
to collaborate and how they worked, so I learned a ton about educational testing from that LDTC. So when I redid my own son's educational testing, because
Yeah.
my son is neurodivergent, I
Uh-huh.
knew what all those numbers meant, all those
Ooh.
tests, So I think I definitely think find your people, and
Yes.
they don't always have to be BCBAs. There's a lot of trainings out there on school-based
Okay.
stuff that you can find.
Yeah.
I certainly do trainings and workshops and things. I'm doing a workshop in a few weeks for an organization. Another organization that I like is the Behavior Toolbox.
Hmm. I know that
They
one. Okay.
are one of the BCBAs there is Dr. Paul Gavoni. He
Oh,
actually has a podcast on
yeah.
public schools and ABA.
It's so
His
funny. I just wrote his name down. Like sometimes I have like our questions here, but I wrote down it says Paul Gavoni, like as a future guest. I was like not thinking about what we were talking about, but just what we were talking about. Maybe think
No,
about Paul Gavoni.
he's really great. He does. I've listened to him talk a number of times. I'm adjunct faculty at Endicott College, and actually he is as well.
I've never
So
heard him
I've
speak.
had
I just see him everywhere. I know like Matt Sikoria, him and I think somebody else maybe had a
Anika
course.
Costa.
Yeah, had a course
Yeah.
together. But no, I don't know anything about Paul Gavoni. I just see him. He does a pretty good job on social media. So I had written his name down. I'm
Yes,
like,
he's
what
very
we're
active
talking
on
about.
social media,
Yeah.
but he's pretty active on the workshop circuit as well. He
Yes.
does a very good workshop.
Okay.
He talks at multiple places. He does some good stuff. He also has a book that I recommend to, I feel like I joked with him when I saw him at Abba I was like, I feel like must make you a lot of money.
Yeah.
No, I think he doesn't actually make that much money off the book though. But he and Nick Weatherly wrote a book called Deliberate Coaching.
Oh.
And that is a book that I recommend to a lot of my supervisees,
Okay.
a lot of people that are in my classes that tell me
Yeah.
they're doing public school work, because it's really all about coaching, coaching ABA in public schools specifically. It's very public
Wow.
schools focused.
Okay. I'll have to
So
check
it's a
that out.
really great read. Like I said, I teach supervision at Endicott is one of the courses I teach. And it's one, I always like to give my students, some tips and tricks and tools. And that's
Yes.
a book that I recommend to them almost every semester, particularly to my people that tell me that they want to do public schools.
Oh, interesting.
Unfortunately, there is not a lot out there on public schools and ABA.
Right. Yeah.
There are certainly studies, right, about a particular procedure, and it's been done in a public school. So you see a lot of that, but you don't see a ton of articles specifically about, hey, this is how we should operate in public school. But there are a few. Layden et al. 2021 has two publications. One, Selena Layden has two publications. Layden 2021 is actually a set of guidelines that was developed by the Virginia BCBA Public School Collective, something like that. So something like, 15, 20 BCBAs that got together and built these guidelines for BCBAs in Virginia in public schools as to like what BCBAs do in public schools. That's a really, really great tool. I recommend reading that. Actually, I just served on a committee on the New Jersey Department of Ed here, and the New Jersey Department of Ed is coming out with guidelines for public school BCBAs this September. That should be published. And some other tools as well. I can't talk too much about it because it's not officially out yet. But I was on the team of BCBAs that helped work on that. There are definitely going to be some parallels to Layden 2021. So if you want to look at that, that's a good one. She also has another article that she's first author on about building a network of BCBAs, kind of that model that they developed in Virginia, which is really good. Gian Greco et al. Have a really good article about conceptualizing the BCBA as a related service provider in inclusion settings. So that's a good read. I like that one a lot. And as I was telling you before we started taping, there's a group of us at Endicott that are kind of really actively trying to open this line of research. So I have an article that's under review that I'm hoping, I think we'll find a home for it. We have to, we're in kind of the editing. We were in the, I sent it, it came back. I'm in the process of editing it. But I'm hoping that's going to get published, hopefully within the next, I don't know, 6 months to a year. Publishing is a slow process, but that's specifically on ethics in public schools. We're running some focus group studies right now of BCBAs in public schools. And we actually, some of my colleagues who read the original version of my manuscript picked it up and ran a survey. And they're in the middle of going through that data right now. So we have a bunch of other projects that we'd like to do. So we're hoping that, in the next
this is great.
few years, we're gonna like be opening, try to really crack open this line of research so that we're talking a little bit about it in our literature.
Oh, that's great. And thank you for doing that work. I have a membership called the ABA Speech Connection. So there's a component where we do new courses every month. We're an ACE provider and an ASHA provider, but one of the things we do is journal article studies too, where we kind of like read the article, we get together, we talk about it. And I think what is hard sometimes as an ACE provider, because we need to go beyond the task list, is some of the things that I think are important about working in a public school, like some of what we talked about today. Sometimes I get nervous about like, how does some of that go beyond the task list? Although it's very important. I guess I could tie it into like a communication. I have a really nice collaboration article. It might be from somebody from Endicott. It talks about collaboration, and it's like, are you a salad, a stew, or a cake, like based on the continuum of how collaborative you are. And I really love that article. But in the back of that particular article, which I can't remember what it's called, they have a lot of communication strategies. And I try to tie that in when I do like ethics courses about SLP, BCBA collaboration. So I'm sure there's a way to tie all that in, but I'm always thinking like, oh, this would be really good, like to offer in our membership, because I feel like it is so specific. And I feel like it is something that is changing with the field, and people are going to need like mentors and people just as a sounding board. So I'm excited to.
There's a lot of work. There's a lot of work outside of our field too on things like collaborate. Like, like people, I don't know, we're always like, well, it's not in the ABA literature, so we can't do it. That's not really true, right? So, there are things, like evidence-based practices for things like collaboration and stuff, in the field of psychology, for example. Callie Plattner just started a line of research on motivational interviewing. She's published 2 articles. I think both of them, I know one was in behavior analysis and practice. I'm not sure what the other one was, but really motivational interviewing has been around for a really long time. It's just been in the psychological literature. So she's bringing it, she's one of the people.
I do hear it. I hear more about
bringing it into applied behavior analysis as a method of more effective and compassionate collaboration. So there's stuff out there, I think. So I think sometimes it's about looking at what other fields are doing. I think we look a lot at the medical model because of, just the funding sources for a lot of ABA right now. But I think, there are definitely some nuggets that we could be looking at in some of the psychological literature, and then kind of figure out if those things will work for us.
Yeah, I love that. I have like a future CEU in mind. So I think this is really good. Thank you so much for coming onto the show today. Just a wealth of information. Do you have like a website, or if anybody has a question about your work, or maybe just your email that we could put in the show notes as well?
I do. So I actually just started doing some, independent consulting and workshops and stuff. A lot of the stuff I do is around public schools, but I do some other things like acceptance and commitment therapy and, PFA, SBT. I'm a certified professional in that. So it's Oceanviewbehaviorsolutions. We do have a website. It's, we're in the process of making the website a little bit more robust, but my contact information is on there. I can also be emailed at oceanviewbehaviorsolutions@gmail.com.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was great to connect.
Yes, I was thrilled to have you reach out to me. I love talking about ABA in public schools and all that we can do there. So I really hope your viewers find this helpful. And we gotta keep doing good work there and helping as many kids and teachers as we can.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening to Autism Outreach. If you enjoyed the show today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode full of actionable strategies you can use in your therapy room. Write a review too. That would mean so much to me. I always love hearing from you. Have a specific topic that you want included on a future show? Reach out over on Instagram, ABA Speech by Rose, or visit me at www.abaspeech.org.